Hey guys, Sean Dove here, back with another Cinema 4D quick tip. A little while ago, one of you guys sent me this great animation made by a studio called Moose Tank and asked, how could we go about creating a similar animation? In their clip, we see this cool morph transform effect between different pieces of technology, and the whole thing is really impressive. To help myself understand exactly how Moose Tank went about creating this animation, I ended up going frame by frame during one of those morph states to see if I could get any clues. So something that I think I noticed as I was looking at this morph state was that the next pose that we're heading into almost seems to scale up in pieces as the previous one scales down. And then you play this back in real time and that transformation looks seamless. Now, of course, this is oversimplifying what they've done, but it will be the basis for how we start to attack it ourselves. So of course, I was excited to put this technique to the test and see exactly what sort of results we could get. We'll use some of the MoGraph effectors, of course play with some dynamics. All right, I'm excited. Let's jump in, guys. All right, let's jump straight into Cinema and we'll start having a bit of a play. Now, to create this transform effect, I wanted to find two objects that were a similar life-size scale. I wanted to be able to transform the two objects and make it feel real. For example, if I were transforming between the shoe and a car, the car would have to be miniature sized to fit within the same parameters of the shoe, and it's not going to look as realistic. So to demonstrate this technique, I thought we'd have a play around morphing between this Nike shoe model and this football helmet. Now, the reason I think this works quite well is they're a similar life-size scale, and so we're able to accept the transform a bit more realistically. So I'm going to load up this Nike Air Max model. I'm going to leave a link down below. Sorry, mate, I'm not going to be able to pronounce your name there, but this is a great model, and he's got it up there for free downloads. So guys, make sure you go and check this out. He's done an absolutely amazing job. Go and give him a like. All right, so let's load this into Cinema. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. We don't need that text on the ground. Yes, that's our main shoe. And these are our stitches. What we're actually going to do, we'll remove the stitching for this, and we're just going to focus on the shoe itself. I'm going to remove all these texture tags as well for now. We'll do some of our own texturing at the end. All right, so what I'd like to do is just drop a cube into our scene to get a bit of a sense of the scale that this shoe is coming at. And if I zoom out, we can see that that shoe is actually quite small in our scene. So all I'm going to do is hit T and just scale this up a little bit. Now, I'm not being too precise. I just want to be working at a similar scale that I'm used to. And about there is going to work nicely. And we can delete that cube. All right, great. So this is our first model here. The next one we wanted to morph into was that football helmet. And the great thing is we've actually got one built into Cinema here. So I'm going to come into our content browser, into presets, into our default browser, 3D objects. We want to come down to sports items, and then in here we've got the football helmet. So let's load that up. We can jump back into our objects. And you can see if I curl down this football helmet null, we've got a few objects in here as well, building up the helmet. Close that back up. Now, if I scale this at the moment, we can see our axis is a bit funky. So I'm just going to realign that, hit T, and start scaling this up. Now, all I'm trying to do here is get a similar orientation with our shoe. This doesn't have to be perfect. But something like this seems to be working quite nicely. We might want to scale it up a little bit more. Great, I'm happy with that. We've got our helmet and our shoe set in place at about the scale that we're happy with. Now what I want to do is collapse this helmet into just one piece of geometry. So a quick and easy way to do that is to grab a connect, and then we'll place all those objects within that connect. Now, essentially what this connect is doing is welding it all together. I'm just going to change our Phong mode to highest. And then by simply hitting C on that, we've collapsed all that mesh into the one piece. All right, let's just clean up our scene a little bit here. This is our helmet. This is our shoe. And I'm just going to come along and delete all these textures and the selection tags off from our helmet there. Great. I'm also going to hide that helmet just for a moment. And we're just going to focus on the shoe. Now for this technique, what I found is we want this shoe to be able to break off into separate pieces, and they're going to scale down as the helmet begins to scale up. Now, like with our helmet, our shoe was already collapsed into one piece of geometry. So we need to essentially break this up. Now, a great way to do that, let's select our shoe, hold down Alt, come up to MoGraph, and we're going to place this into a fracture. Within our fracture, let's come over to our Object tab, and the mode, we're going to change this to Explode Segments and Connect. Now, nothing happens at the moment, but just to demonstrate what we've got now, I'm going to come up to MoGraph, Effector, and I'm going to apply a Push Apart Effector. Now, our fracture is still selected, so this is automatically going to be applied. I'll change my iterations just to 1. I'll pull this radius in, and you can see what we've got here now is that shoe has been broken apart into all the separate pieces that were initially made to build it. So this is great. We've got all these separate fractures. We've got all these separate fractures of our shoe. I'm going to delete the push apart because we're not going to be using that for this. All right, so let's select our fracture. Let's come up to MoGraph, come to Effectors. And to do this, I think we're just going to use a plane effector. Now, instantly you're going to see everything gets pushed up, and that's because our parameters have this Y value of 100 centimeters. So let's untick the position because we're not going to be using that. Let's, however, turn on scale. I'm going to turn on absolute and uniform scale. And let's set this scale to -1. And now you're going to notice everything has disappeared on us. So let's come over to our Fall Off tab. So to control these fractures scaling back into our scene, we're going to be using the Fall Off tab and just using a linear fall off. I'm going to hit E for my move tool, and you can see this is currently on, and now this is currently on our X plane. You can see when I move this linear field through our scene here, those pieces start to scale back on. So I'm going to scale down our field a little bit. Something like 50 centimeters should be fine. So this is great, but what I actually want is rather than the pieces scaling up from the back, I want to scale them in from the front here. So let's change our direction to -X. And now as we come through the front of our scene here, you can see those pieces scale in from the front, and that's exactly what I'm after. So I'm going to pull our linear field so everything's disappeared. Now we're going to scale into this shoe. So let's come forward about 10 frames and we'll add a keyframe to our linear field position. I'm going to come to frame 40. I'm working at 30 frames a second here, so that'll be 1 second in our timeline. And we'll move this linear field so everything's scaled back into our scene. Let's add another keyframe there. And great, as I scrub through the timeline now, you're going to see those pieces scale in. All right, that's looking all right, but we want to make these a bit more dynamic. It's just feeling a little bit, it's not feeling as exciting as we could make it. So a real quick way we can add a bit more interest as these scale back in is to add a delay effector. So with our fracture selected, let's come up to MoGraph, over to Effector, and let's add a delay effector. Let's come over to the Effector tab, and we'll change our mode to spring, and we'll just increase this a little bit. Let's try maybe somewhere about 70%. Now let's play through that. And already that starts to look a little bit more interesting. Those pieces have a little bit more wobble before they finally rest in that final position. Now playing that through, that felt a little bit quick. So let's grab our linear field, and I'm just going to grab that keyframe we set at frame 40 and pull it 10 frames further away. Let's add a little bit more time to that animation. Now before we go too much further, we're going to get a few extra pieces happening in our scene. So let's just tidy this up a little bit. So this is our shoe fracture. This is our plane shoe scale up. And this is our delay shoe. Great. So in our linear field, at the moment, all this is doing, in our plane effector, at the moment, all we're doing is scaling these pieces up. But if we come over to our parameter, let's actually enable position. Now, rather than 100 in the Y, let's just go something like 30. So essentially now these pieces are a little bit in the air before they come flying back down. Let's add a little bit more to make that a bit more obvious. There we go. You can see the pieces are coming from the sky now as they scale up. Now, that's a little bit too much for me. Let's go back to something like 40. Great. Just a little bit goes a long way there. All right, I want to make this shoe feel a little bit more dynamic in our scene. So I'm going to grab a disc, and this disc is going to form a bit of a ground for us. Let's jump into our 4 views. Now we've already sort of been animating our shoe where it is. So what I'm going to do is just grab this disc, just make sure our animation's completely played out there. It looks like our shoe is static. I'm going to pull this disc and just create a slight intersection with our shoe. Let's jump back into our perspective view. I'm just going to scale this disc up. Great. And this is our ground. So with our ground selected, let's go tags, simulation tags, and we'll just add a collider body. And what that's going to do is just make our ground static, and it's going to make that nice and rigid for us there. Now let's do the same thing with our shoe fracture. Let's come up to tags, simulation tags, and I'm going to apply a rigid body to this one. Now let's rewind and see what we've got at the moment. Now as I play that through, you can see that we no longer have that in our scene. And the reason for this is I'm just going to set a camera so we can come back to this spot. If I zoom out, yeah, our shoe has fallen away on us. So let's rewind, jump back into our camera. And under the forces tab of our dynamics tag on our shoe fracture, I'm just going to add a little bit of follow position and follow rotation. I might even add just a little bit of drag. Now let's have a look at that. Nice, that's starting to look a little bit more interesting as it scales into our scene here. I'm just going to get rid of all these textures so that they're not distracting us, so we can come back to creating some of our own a little bit later. All right, nice. All right, nice. That was looking pretty good. Those pieces were scaling up quite nicely. Under our linear field, we were just getting a little bit of that color showing through. So I'm just going to make sure we've got no remapping happening from the color. Now let's have another play through. Nice, I'm quite happy with that. That shoe's looking pretty good as it scales in. All right, so we've now got our shoe pretty much set and ready to go. So now we need to start having to think about that helmet. But before we do, what I'm going to do is on the dynamics tag, I'm going to come over to the cache tab. And what we're going to do is bake our object. So let's do that. And the reason we're doing this is we're also going to be using dynamics to scale down the helmet, but we don't want them to be interfering with the dynamics that we've just set for our shoe. Now we can go and tweak these a little bit later, but at least for now, That animation's now set, so we can scrub through our timeline and get that dynamic effect. And that was all going a bit funky. Let's just turn off that delay effector. And now as I scale these through, you can see that that dynamic has been baked in. All right, great. So now let's start having a bit of a play with the helmet. Let's toggle that back on in our scene. Now with it selected, let's hold down Alt, and we're also going to put this into a fracture object. Now just like before, when we did this with our shoe, the fracture object's going to recognize all those separate pieces that we welded together before with the connect object. But what we need to do is come over to the object tab and make sure we change this to explode segments and connect. Now the good thing is we've already sort of got that animation that we're happy with set in that previous plane effector. So let's grab that. I'm going to make a copy of that one. And then let's rename this plane helmet scale down. Let's come into our fracture that is our helmet. Come over to the effectors tab, and let's just drag and drop that plane effector into our effectors. Now, if we go to frame 0, what you're going to notice is that plane effector is actually already scaled down our helmet, but what we want is for it to be the opposite. So what we need to do is come over to our linear field and change the direction from -x to +x. Now the keyframe for this one is on frame 10, so let's just grab that. We'll pull it back to frame 0. I'm also going to hit E on my keyboard, and we just need to pull this plane effector a little bit further away. You can see it's already starting to scale down some of those front pieces. So let's just pull this back a little bit and reset that keyframe. Now as we play through, we're going to get the helmet scaling down as the shoe scales up. All right, that wasn't too bad, but there's still a bit more we can do to improve this helmet. I'm just going to hide our shoe for now, just so we can focus on this helmet. All right, so we got that animation scaling it down. What I am going to do is grab that keyframe and just pull it maybe pull it to about frame 5. All right, so let's have another look at this. We've got the moving through, and those pieces are also scaling up into the air. Now, I don't necessarily want that, so let's grab our helmet plane and we'll just remove any of that position. So now all they're doing is just scaling down on the spot. Great. Let's grab our helmet fracture. All right, so we've got that scaling down. Let's make one more copy of this plane effector. And what this is going to be is our helmet scale up. So what we're going to do here is use this in our effectors of the helmet fracture. Let's drag and drop that in there. And what we're going to be using this one to do is scale the pieces slightly up before our other plane effector erases them. So let's come into that plane effector, and rather than -1, let's make this 2, and we'll see what that does. Come over to the linear field and make sure that keyframe is set to frame 0. Now as I scrub through the timeline, you're going to see those pieces start to scale up before the other effector starts to scale them away again. And it's a nice little way to just add a bit more emphasis to that scaled down effect, rather than it just being so jarring to the eye. We've now got this little bit of overshoot, and we understand what's potentially about to happen. So at the moment we're scaling these up far too much. Let's try something like 1. Here we go. Just a little bit can go a long way there. All right, what we also might want to do is this scale down is just pull it back maybe 10 frames. So it's going to be completely gone by frame 40. All right, great. Now, as we were animating here, as those pieces scaled up, what you might have noticed is our helmet intersected with the ground a little bit, so we don't want that. So let's grab our helmet fracture. Let's come over to tags, simulation tags, and let's add a rigid body. Again, let's come over to the force tab, and we'll just add a value of 10 in both the follow position and follow rotation. Now for a moment, I'm just going to disable the plane effectors affecting our helmet. And the reason for this is I just want to play it a little bit. One second. So as I hit play then, let me show you that again. Our helmet starts to spaz out, and this is because although our shoe isn't visible in our scene, the dynamics are still taking effect. So I'm just going to select the dynamics tag on our shoe fracture. I'm just going to disable them for now. So let's come back to our shoe. Sorry, let's come back to our helmet, hit play again, and great. All we wanted to have happen there was for it to pop up onto the ground. And now we can say set initial state. Let's come back to frame 0, and now it's fixed on the ground there. We've got it in a perfect position. We've got none of that intersection. Let's enable all of our plane effectors, and let's hit play. All right, I feel like we lost all the scale there, so we might need to go, I think the scale of 1 hasn't done anything for us, so let's try 1.5. Because we changed the end frame of our scale down, our scale up is happening too late for the pieces to even be visible. So let's grab this keyframe that we've got set on frame 50 at the moment to finish the scale down. I'm going to pull this to about frame 35. That way it's definitely going to be ahead of our scale down. And now I'm thinking, all right, so after watching that, now I'm thinking that maybe a value of 1 could be plenty here. Let's have a look. All right, that's not looking too bad. All right, that's not looking too bad. I'm thinking that's probably plenty for us there. Last thing I might do is just grab that last keyframe, pull it to frame 40, so both the scale up and scale down are going to be finishing at the same point. All right, let's take one more look at that. So the plane effector scales up those pieces before it scales them down. And what I think I've just noticed there is we're actually not scaling these pieces down far enough. So I'm just going to grab our scale down plane, linear field, just push that along just a little bit. Looks like about 20 centimeters is more than enough, and reset that keyframe. Now I'm not using a delay effector scaling down our helmet because I think we've got enough, because I think we've been able to create enough interest with that scale up and the dynamics of it sitting on the ground there. Now to be able to get these to play back with the helmet and the shoe, we're going to have to come over to our dynamics tag on our helmet, and let's just bake that in the cache tag. Nice. Great, let's turn back on our shoe fracture. Re-enable those dynamics, and they should still remain baked for us. Let's hit play and see what we get. Now it all looks pretty crazy when you're watching it back at this speed, but you got to remember all this animation is happening within 2 seconds. So it's all very quick. And what I sometimes like to do in these cases where we're not getting real-time playback in our scene, a good way to test how quickly your animation is playing out, and if you're getting the results you're really after, let's come into our render settings and let's just do a hardware render. Let's make sure our output is set to all frames here. We don't need to save this. We're just having a bit of a look to see how this animation is starting to form. Let's send that to the picture viewer. And by doing a hardware render, we're essentially just rendering out the viewport. So it's a great way to see exactly what's going on, and it'll allow us to then watch it back in real time. So now when I hit play, we're actually getting some pretty good results there. Now it's jumping around a little bit as it's rendering these frames still. But because that morph happens so quickly, your eye doesn't get a chance to really recognize those individual pieces scaling down. And we start to create this great morphing effect. You can see as I scrub just through this timeline now, we can see those helmet pieces scaling up before they start to scale back down. And about frame 20, we start to see the front of the shoe coming in before it sort of just rests on the ground there because of that dynamics. All right, great. This is looking pretty cool. All right, so to take this a little bit further, we've essentially got the animation set there. It was a nice quick little setup. Just using a handful of those plane effectors. And the real key thing I found was to just bake out those dynamics separately, and then we're able to incorporate multiple dynamic simulations without them affecting one another. Okay, so I said I wanted to touch briefly also on the texturing of that final little piece that we saw. So this is the actual scene that I used to create that animation. I thought we'd break it down quickly and see how it came together. Now this was built the exact same way, using a couple of those plane effectors and that delay effector on the shoe to create a bit more of that bounce as it hits the ground. And we can see this is done with just two simple textures, and I think that's really the key with this technique. Like in the original example, we saw that the whole thing was done with what seemed to be just the one texture. It was really simply done, and what that's going to do is help mask any potential jarring artifacts that will take place during the morph. If we had real complex texturing on both of the models and they were completely different, the whole morph isn't going to feel as natural. It's really not going to work as well. So I think the key is to keep it simple, and so we're just going to use two textures in this case. So I applied the white to the overall transform, and that's going to apply to everything. And then I've just got these gold highlights on certain aspects of the actual model. So you can see on the helmet, I've just applied it to the mask and some of those bolts. And if we jump forward in the timeline to get our shoe back in frame here, you can see I've just got that white covering the full shoe and just got that gold Nike tick coming in. Just to add a little bit more interest between the actual morph, we follow those textures across both of the models, and I think that's really the key here. So these textures were very simple. You can see I've got a white material that is applied to the whole thing, and if I jump into here, you can see I've just got that default specular. Our color's cranked to 100% white, and that's it, keeping it nice and simple for that one. And our gold material here, if you guys have R20, you can come up to your node materials, and there's some great presets in here that I've been playing around with. And in this case, I just grabbed the gold material, and that's what we've applied to the face mask and that Nike tick. Now, in hindsight, texturing at the start might have made this a bit easier, particularly for the helmet, because we already had these pieces separated. So what we could have done is applied the texture to the face mask and to those bolts, and then merged it into the one mesh, and that way we've already got it textured. But so in our case today, we actually flattened and merged that mesh right at the beginning, but we can still go in there and make selections and apply the texture. So I thought, let's just do that quickly, because our shoe example, that Nike tick was already baked into the mesh, so we would have had to have made that selection. So I'm going to jump forward in my timeline to get my shoe in frame here. If I grab the shoe, I'm actually just going to delete that gold texture tag off our shoe just so we get that white base mesh. I'll show you how easy it is. We can dive in there and make a selection to apply our texture. So I'm going to jump out of our camera and just frame up our shoe here, just so I got my Nike tick in view. So what we want to do is make a polygon selection of just this tick. So I'm going to zoom in nice and close. And what I'm going to do is look for the very outside edge. And it looks like it's sort of intersecting and wrapping around here. So what I want to do is hit UL to bring up my loop selection. And I'm going to make sure I select the loop that's wrapping around the entire frame. We can then spin out, I'm going to hit UF to fill that selection, hold down Shift and select. Let's zoom out. I'm going to come up to select, come down to set selection. Then we can apply that gold material to our shoe. And you can see that's going to turn our entire shoe into that gold material. So all we need to do is grab that texture and just feed in that selection tag into the selection field. And easy, just like that, our Nike tick has got that gold texture applied. And jump back into my camera here. So that's a real simple way, and you can do the exact same thing on your helmet because we merged that. You'd go in there, grab a loop selection, fill it, and you might find you need to do it a couple of times on complicated meshes like that face guard. But it's pretty quick to move through and make those selections. All right, great. So in my little test example, I lit this real quickly with a HDR studio rig from Grayscale Gorilla, but I thought let's have a quick look at making our own studio lighting just in case you guys don't have the rig. So I'm going to delete that from our scene. So I've already got our ground plane in here, so I'm going to turn that back on. All right, so let's jump up into our render settings. And what do we need to do here? So because we're going to be using HDR lighting, we're going to need to enable global illumination. And I've actually got a little preset down here for when I do use GI, and you can see here, I'm just using the QMC for both the primary and the secondary method here. If I jump into the ambient occlusion, you can see I've got that enabled just for some contact shadows. I'll jump into my physical renderer. I'm just using a fixed sampler. You can see these are the numbers that I've just found tend to work for me, and you guys can feed them in as well if you'd like. All right, so let's grab ourselves a sky. Let's make a new material. Disable the color and the reflectance, and let's enable the luminance. I'm going to jump into my luminance here, and this is where I'm going to feed in a HDR image of just this little studio setup, and I'll make it available for download if you guys want to have a play using the same one. So I'm going to open that up, close that down, and just apply that to our sky. Let's grab our sky because we don't want to see this in our render. We purely want it to light our scene. So let's come up to tags, Cinema 4D tags, and go to compositing. And we just want to composite this from the background. All right, so we've got our ground here. I'm just going to apply the same white material that we've got on our helmet to the ground. And then we just need to come in and apply a background. And we can copy that same material onto our background. Now at the moment, if I hit render, all right, we're still seeing the sky. So if I hit render at the moment, you can see we're still seeing the sky. So let's come back into our compositing tag, and I'm going to composite the background for HDR maps as well. Let's hit render again. Let's make sure, okay, so I haven't enabled that render setting that we just went through before. So I'm going to tick that on, and let's hit render again. Let's have another look. This should be starting to look a bit nicer for us now. All right, so that's taken a little bit to render. I'm just going to jump into my physical render. I'm just going to jump back into our render settings, and in the physical tab, so we've got these settings. This is tend to what I use to have that nice high quality finish, but there's a few things we can do with these numbers to speed up the render time while we're just testing out our scene here. So with our sampler subdivisions, I'm going to bring that down to something like 2. And then with each of these, I'm just going to knock our blurriness subdivision down to about 4, our shadow subdivision to 2, and maybe our subsurface scattering to 1. Let's hit render and just see if that's managed to speed up our scene a little bit here. All right, that's certainly coming through much quicker. We can see some nice contact shadows thanks to that ambient occlusion. We are getting a little bit more noise because we've lowered the quality of the render, but you can see it's spitting it out far quicker for us, and we're getting some great feedback as to exactly what the render is going to look like. Now, it looks like at the moment we can see we're still getting our sky actually showing in the scene. We can see our ground is ending, and then we're getting this darkness, which is actually our sky in the background. I'm going to jump back into our sky, into our compositing tag, and just also untick scene by camera. I'm just going to enable our interactive render region. This should make it render a bit quicker for us, and we don't need to render the whole mask. We're just going to we're just setting up we're just setting up that background and sky at the moment. Nice. Now we're no longer seeing the sky, but we're still getting all the great reflections thanks to that image that's actually on it. But at the moment, we're getting a bit of disconnect between our background and the actual floor. So let's come into our ground, come up to tags, and we're also going to apply a compositing tag to this. On this one, let's just enable compositing background. And our interactive render region should start to fix this up. Here we go. And just like that, we've got this nice clean blend between the background and the floor. All right, great. I hope this was a bit of fun, guys. Something to take away from it. Like I love to do, we're mainly focusing today on the actual creation of the animation, but I hope you could take something away from really briefly touching on the textures and a quick way to set up some lighting to get some great feedback of our actual scenes. All right, thanks again, guys. See you again soon. Cheers.
What song? Join us on the flip side, motherfucker. How about this one? Like what you saw? Ring the bell. Click that subscribe button. Come join us with Thor, the god of render.